Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on law's relationship with the North Saskatchewan River. I'm Pat Parody, Executive Director of the Centre for Constitutional Studies in the Faculty of Law at the University of Alberta, and I'm very pleased to be moderating today's webinar. Now, to begin, I'd like to encourage you all to think about, take note of the land that you inhabit. This webinar is coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, and we honor the ancestors, traditions, and the spirit that first drew Indigenous people, the Cree, Blackfoot, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Saulteaux, and Métis, and then settlers to this gathering place. And we're grateful for the many benefits we've received as a result of Treaty 6, which was signed in 1876. We also recognize the ongoing acts of settlement and colonization that take place here, and that honoring this land and its ancestors is only a very small step in recognizing the spirit and intent of the treaty and of our efforts towards reconciliation. Now, today's webinar, Law's Relationship with the North Saskatchewan River, is part of a Reimagining Rivers series organized by the Centre for Constitutional Studies and the Environmental Law Centre in Edmonton. The series aims to examine the ways in which law prevents a flourishing of the environment, and by extension, our own flourishing, because we're part and parcel of that environment. And the series aims to suggest new paradigms for ways of thinking about how our legal structures could be reimagined to allow and even create a healthy, nourishing environment for all of us. Now, to date, we've hosted webinars on rivers as legal persons with rights, Indigenous jurisdiction and the environment, where Cree and Haida laws were presented, and our last webinar, which challenged us to look differently at the ways in which we perceive animals as legal beings. Now, in today's webinar, our speaker, Associate Professor Cam Jeffries, will explain how law understands the notion of sustainable development and how it uses that term and what the impacts of the use and understandings are for the environment. And he is going to encourage a rethinking of sustainability that puts environment, as opposed to development, at its core. And apparently the North Saskatchewan River will run through it. Now, before I introduce our speaker, this is a reminder that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel, that is the Centre for Constitutional Studies YouTube channel, but it will also be accessible on our website as well as the Environmental Law Centre website as of tomorrow. Professor Jeffries is going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then he will answer your questions, which we encourage you to put into the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and you can use that button to enter your questions throughout this presentation. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Cam Jeffries, who is an associate professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Alberta. Cam specializes in environmental law and wildlife conservation and is passionate about local environmental action and law reform. He received his law degree from the University of Alberta and was called to the bar in 2010. He then earned a Master of Laws and a Doctor of Juridical Science from the University of Virginia, where he studied as a Fulbright Scholar. Before entering academia, he practiced law at Field LLP in Edmonton and worked as a research associate for the Health Law Institute at the University of Alberta. Since then, he's published several books and chapters and articles in Canadian and US law journals. And in addition to his academic and professional curiosity in environmental law, oceans law, and wildlife conservation, Professor Jeffries maintains a keen interest in public interest advocacy, and he remains active in promoting local environmental law reform. And so, without further ado, and Cam has asked that I keep his introduction short, Professor Jeffries, would you please begin?
Thank you very much, Pat. That was more than a generous introduction, so I really appreciate it. So I'll just start sharing here and we will jump right in. Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. The topic, as Pat mentioned, is looking at, I think, one of the organizing principles for modern environmental law, one of the overarching ideas that really has been the paradigm for modern environmental law, and trying to shift our perspective on it a little bit to go against the current in the way that it has been applied, with a couple different examples, and specifically with a case study that we'll turn to towards the end of the talk on the North Saskatchewan River and the river valley itself. So the formal title of the talk, Advancing Law's Relationship with the North Saskatchewan River and its river valley. A less formal title, An Ecologically Sustainable River Runs Through It. So I'd also like to echo Pat's land acknowledgement and ongoing efforts in Canada for reconciliation. I'd also like to add, as we're talking about the North Saskatchewan River and its valley, that this is a very important place where use and occupation by Canada's Indigenous peoples extends back thousands of years. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about some of the topics that I'll be looking at today, there was a report that was published a couple years ago, right before the pandemic started. So not too long in real time, but what seems like a very long time in the lived experience on municipal biodiversity conservation and areas of municipal innovation. And I've put this is just the cover of the report, and then the link to its publicly available source here. This report looked at some of the amendments that had happened to the Municipal Governments Act starting in 2015, which empowers local action in the province for all of the municipalities, and the city charters that had come in for the large municipalities, including Edmonton, and explored different ways that the cities could look to make a contribution to the biodiversity crisis. And so some of today's comments are drawn from that report, but a lot of the particulars and some of the extra details can be found in there if you're looking for something a little bit more. And then obviously drawing inspiration for today's talk from the North Saskatchewan River Valley. As Pat mentioned, I got my law degree and my science degree from the U of A. I was born in Edmonton, and I spent a lot of time in my youth in and around the North Saskatchewan River, and have experienced a bit of an evolving relationship with it that I think a lot of us that are here today are able to kind of share. So it's an area of shared concern, and one that will hopefully bring some of the ideas and concepts that I'm talking about today home in a very real and perhaps tangible manner. So in brief, this is the outline for what I'd like to try and cover together in the next 40 to 50 minutes. We're going to start with a basic description of what sustainability and sustainable development is in terms of a legal concept. And from there, we're going to transition into what I think is a very effective critique of sustainable development, one presented by a German academic who is in New Zealand named Klaus Bosselmann, who has written pretty extensively on what sustainable development means and what it ought to mean if we reorient it towards a goal of ecological sustainability and reprioritize environmental outcomes and environmental limits as being forefront in our mind if we're thinking about long-term stewardship and long-term conservation initiatives. Then I'm going to offer a few examples that help transition I think the theoretical or critique that Bosselmann offers and brings it home in a way that hopefully is a little bit more tangible and resonates. We'll start with an international example. Anyone that knows me knows that every single talk I give, I have to work whales in some capacity. So we'll look at an endangered species example that a lot of Albertans are also aware of. And then we will look at a local example, which is the North Saskatchewan River. And then we'll consider some justifications for enhanced local conservation, including the objective of maintaining the North Saskatchewan River Valley's functionality as a wildlife corridor, and what that means and what some of the management actions could be to help advance that objective if we decide that that is a social priority. Okay, so let's start at the beginning then. Let's start with this idea of sustainable development. And if it's not a word that you look for presently, after our talk is done, I'd encourage you to pay attention to it or keep your ears open to it, because it is pitched at us in every way. Sustainability, sustainable development, sustainable this, sustainable that. It is something that is a legal term. It is something that is a social and cultural goal. It is something that's talked about in economic circles. And it's also something that is utilized quite heavily in marketing and business. So it is a buzzword for sure. And it has its origins in terms of its modern application going back to the 1970s and into the 1980s. However, the modern kind of or dominating perception of sustainable development as a legal principle derives its application from the Brundtland Commission's definition in 1987. And that is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So a nice succinct framing of a principle that says we need to be able to survive today, but also thrive in the future. And it's cast in a human-oriented manner, all right, looking at what the needs of the present generation is, conceptualizing those, and then looking at ways in which we can meet them and still advance or propel ourselves into our future existence. So that's kind of the traditional conception. 1987, that's international soft law, it's called. So that was a way that the international community could develop something without having to include it in a binding treaty. Now, it has taken on many forms and it's been applied in many different contexts, both hard and soft, at international and domestic law. And the one that we hear about quite a bit recently are the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And these were articulated and presented in 2015 as 17 goals or objectives that should be reached or at least progress made in by 2030. Okay, and so we move from this early definition of sustainable development, which says, right, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And then we move into something where this has been unpacked, right? This has been unpacked, and it's been unpacked along a number of different social, cultural, environmental, and economic lines. Okay, and so we see that these are very broad goals. So no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, et cetera, et cetera. And we also see that, some of these don't, well, a lot of them have environmental issues at the core because it is connected to so many of our social and cultural processes. But we see that a lot of them, right, are still human-centric until we move into some of the areas about climate action, life below water, and life on land. So we get considerable unpacking of this. And this is one of the main critiques or main I think points of contention around sustainable development is you can really fit whatever you want under this broad umbrella principle or this broad umbrella objective, right? And so we can move towards very important and very necessary goals like gender equality and reduced inequalities between different populations and individuals. However, we are still drifting away from some of the core notions of sustainability. And so that, I think, is one of the interesting points of discussion as we look to achieve these. And now a lot of these are aspirational with no real chance of actually being completely met by 2030, right? So there will not be zero poverty or zero hunger by 2030, but as the normative objective, I think there is strength in trying to articulate that and trying to move our societies globally in that direction. So if that's right, if that is the broad room or the hall that we can fit sustainable development in, how does it work, right? How does it operate? What are some of the different ways in which we can conceive of this idea, if it is in fact the overarching paradigm within which we approach environmental conservation and resource stewardship today? Okay, well, minimally, sustainable development in this traditional conception is looked at as a balance. It's looked at as striking a balance between economic, social and cultural and environmental objectives and outcomes. All right, so it is saying, how do we find the right mix? How do we find the right mixture of economic considerations, social progress and development, cultural concerns, and environmental objectives that are going to allow us to move into the future? And I think that that's right. That's an admirable objective. I mean, those are the balancings that have to occur if we're hoping to continue to thrive as a civilization and as a species. So there's nothing that is inherently incorrect with that. Right now, the problem though becomes that this is such a broad umbrella term. Right, it is something that has been positioned at the heart of most, if not all, modern environmental laws at all levels of government and governance. So from the federal to the provincial and even down to the municipal. But the problem becomes, what place does environment end up occupying within this framework? Right, as soon as we start the balance between the economic and the social and the environmental, what right is environment 1/3, or is it something less than that? Or when would an environmental objective end up trumping or being seen as more important than an economic one or a social outcome, as this human conception of sustainability is put forward? So that becomes a challenge, because the short answer is that environmental objectives are often co-opted by economic and social outcomes, which are prioritized. And the problem is that we have positioned something like sustainable development within our growth-oriented and techno-industrial global society. Right, we have put it within a system that is highly extractive, resource intense. The levels of consumption and pollution production are significant, and trying to achieve this objective is often plagued by externalities like pollution and other forms of harm that aren't captured in the traditional calculation that's being done. And so within this Western, at least, conception of growth dominated society, of accumulation of wealth, of extraction of non-renewable resources, or utilization of renewable resources at a pace that simply isn't renewable, environmental objectives are often sacrificed on the altar of economic and social progress. And so what started, or what had its origins in the goal of environmental conservation or of environmental management, gets lost along the way. Okay, they can be left behind as the balancing favors shorter term objectives like economic outcomes or social and cultural progress. And so that's a major challenge for implementing this or operationalizing something like a broad concept of sustainable development. So that leads to the main questions. I mean, that's just sustainable development in a nutshell. It's obviously a very nuanced and powerful concept that extends beyond what I have said, but that's kind of just a primer on some of the ways in which it has been defined, some of the ways it has been operationalized, and some of the overarching concerns with it. And so that leads us to a couple important questions. And those questions are, first, is sustainable development something that we can achieve under prevailing social values and conditions? Is this actually an objective that is worth striving towards? And is it something that is worth positioning at the heart of environmental conservation and stewardship? Or should we be looking at an alternative? And second, what do we make of the fact that sustainable development has been this broad goal since the 1980s? Yet the evidence suggests that in many ways we are getting worse. We are consistently overshooting the sustainable limits that we have set, both in an additive sense and an extractive sense. And by that, I mean we continue to exacerbate the climate problem, right? And that's an additive issue because we are emitting into the atmosphere on an ongoing basis ever increasing concentrations of greenhouse gases. And we're also overshooting it from an extractive perspective, and that is the rate of depletion of non-renewable resources, but also the rate at which we are depleting traditionally renewable resources, including life in the ocean, including life on land, and including some other renewable resources like forestry, etc. And we're accruing this large ecological debt, right? And at some point, this ecological debt is going to become too burdensome or too significant for us to simply pay down the interest, and we might get consumed by it. And at that point, you enter into ecological bankruptcy, and at that point, we are in very significant trouble, right? And so some have suggested that we are beyond the realm of sustainable development, that it is no longer or it should no longer operate as the primary paradigm for environmental law or environmental decisions. Rather, we should be framing it differently. We should be conceptualizing of a different approach to our relationship with the environment, to our relationship with non-living, with living and non-living aspects of our ecosystem, and that we need to find a way to actually prioritize and emphasize the environmental piece of the balance, which has been to a certain extent left behind. All right, so that's one of the conceptions or issues with the way this is approaching. Okay, so then we have let's try and approach this in a different sense. Let's challenge sustainable development from the ecological perspective, and to do that, we can reframe this. We can recast sustainable development as ecological sustainability. And here's a nice perception or approach to that by an individual who is involved in some of the efforts for early drafting of some of the international documents that would inform the development of sustainability. And that is, right, as Prescott Allen puts it, that we need to find ways in which we shift the behavior of entire societies towards the biosphere, to transform them, to make sure that we are achieving conservation objectives. And to do this, we need a new ethic, and a new ethic that embraces plants and animals as well as people, which will enable human societies to live in harmony with the natural world on which they depend for survival and well-being. And I know through this speaker series, through the Imagining speaker series, we have seen some of these approaches that have been put forward. So the rights of nature, or reconceptualizing the way in which we protect or understand animals within the environment, and indigenous perspectives and indigenous law and different ways of moving beyond a Western-centric approach to understanding, appreciating, and stewarding our natural world. And so a lot of that, I think, is contained or encapsulated here in what Prescott Allen is saying. And it's interesting to note that these ideas were on the table, right, when sustainable development was being articulated. However, as we have seen, or as I've tried to present to you, they have become watered down with the passage of time. And so it's really on that theme of ecological sustainability, of the core of environmental protection and management, that Klaus Bosselmann's critique of sustainability and sustainable development enters the scene. All right, and to me, this is the most compelling critique of sustainable development that I have come across. There are many that are out there. There are different ways that people have argued that sustainable development could be utilized or challenged in terms of its application in different areas. But this to me is quite compelling in terms of a way forward for reimagining the way in which we perceive of sustainable development. And that is that Bosselman says we need to step back and we need to assess what sustainable development looks like. We need to challenge what it looks like or how we are applying it. And we need to do this in two ways. Okay, we need to assess how we've defined it, right? We need to assess how we have defined sustainable development, because the way that we have defined it and the way that we are working with it as a legal principle limits or hamstrings the way in which we can use it going forward. And second, once we've looked at that definition, we need to challenge how it's been applied and how it's been operationalized through law and policy, right? So it's dual. There's a dual track here that Bosselman is arguing for. He says, first, we need to revisit its definition and its functionality as a principle and as a goal. And then second, we need to try and conceive of different ways that we can apply it or operationalize it in law and policy to make it function more effectively or as a better tool for long-term stewardship and management. And so Bosselman recasts the principle, and in doing that, he puts ecological sustainability at the core and at the forefront. And to him, that means that we need to look to identify a duty to protect and restore the integrity of the Earth's ecological systems. All right, so it's not so much, or it's not sufficient to say we are going to balance environmental outcomes with social and economic goals, but rather it says we need to put first and foremost and paramount the duty to protect and restore the integrity of the Earth's ecological systems. Okay, and so this, he says, is a conception of sustainability that is morally grounded. There is an ethic that exists within this idea. There is a demand to take restorative action. So it isn't simply enough to say that going forward, we will try and minimize some of the harms that we are doing to the environment, but rather he is saying, let's protect what we have and restore what we have lost. And third, he's saying that this is sufficient and capable of bearing legal implementation, right? And so it is able to function as a duty. All right, and it is something that could bear legal implementation, meaning it is a goal or an objective that could operate through law in its different manifestations. So as statutory law, or as worked in through the common law, or as an aspect of constitutional law, depending on the jurisdiction that we're speaking to. Okay, so there is strength in that, in recasting the traditional balancing of sustainable development, and saying instead, right, let's perceive of ecological sustainability as something that exists at the core of this concept, and from that, our duty to protect and restore the ecological systems of the Earth, the biosphere, and different aspects of ecology comes to the forefront. Okay, so he takes it one step further and he says, look, there's nothing wrong with desiring economic prosperity, and there's nothing wrong with striving for social justice and social development. But if you want that, if you want these long-term outcomes, then look after the environment first, right? As Pat mentioned in her introduction, that this is where we derive our goods and services from. Right? This is where we derive our economic prosperity from. We can do all that we want to feel that we are apart and separate from the natural world, but that is an artificial barrier that we put between us and our reality. And those realities, when we think of the pandemic, when we think of climate change, when we think of species loss, all of those artificial barriers that we have tried to put between us and our natural origins and realities start to come crashing down. And so to Bosselman, he would say ecological sustainability does not ignore social and economic goals, but rather there is no economic prosperity without social justice, and there is no social justice without economic prosperity, and both must be achieved within the limits of ecological sustainability, because that is the foundation, right? The foundation for what we rely on, for our goods, for our services, for our very existence is what we need to construct these objectives upon. So it is not enough to balance them. Rather, they should be built upon the solid foundation of ecological sustainability. Okay, so long-term prosperity, both economic and social, then must occur within ecologically defined sustainable limits. So if that's Bosselman's approach, what does that look like if we try and transition to practical examples? So is there a way to start to articulate that? And Bosselman has, I think, some good examples in his own book. He's got a couple editions. If you're interested in learning more about his approach, it's called The Principle of Sustainability: Transforming Law and Governance. But I thought we could pull on a couple here that might resonate with us as we're thinking about our own world and our own lives and some of the different ways in which we conceive of sustainable development. And I thought we could start globally and then transition to regional and then get back to the river and think about it uniquely in a local way. So the first example is the Planetary Boundaries example. And the Stockholm Resilience Center does a really nice job articulating something called the Planetary Boundaries, started by Johan Rockström, and an initiative that's been carried through. Now, what these planetary boundaries are trying to present is a representation of the conditions that have made the Holocene as a geological epoch or era quite fertile for human thriving and for life thriving on Earth. And they're saying, what about the human interaction with the biosphere? What about the human interaction with the natural world, and how we as actors are disrupting that balance, right? How we are changing the environment in a way that is threatening our ability to continue to thrive, right? Jeopardizing, obviously, social and economic objectives. And so this resonates, right? I took this one quotation here from Johan, which says, "Let the environment guide our development." And I think that resonates neatly with what Bosselman would say about sustainability and the way we should be moving forward with this. And so what the Stockholm Resilience Center has done with the Planetary Boundaries exercise through a series of publications in reputable journals is to say, these are 9 areas of limits, right? These are 9 limits that we have that if we start disrupting them, they are going to have consequences for the future survival of our species, right? The ability to thrive in the longer term. And so those include, right, land system change, biosphere integrity, climate change, ozone depletion in the atmosphere, loading the atmosphere with aerosols, ocean acidification, and nutrient cycles and biogeochemical flows, and then freshwater use. So we have 9 that have been put forward as having quantifiable limits, thresholds. When we pass them, we enter into zones of concern, and then we enter into zones of danger. All right, and the goal then would be to constrain human activity to keep them within the green, because the green are areas that are below the boundaries that have been defined by science, which are telling us that these are the optimal conditions for long-term survival. And as you'll see, there's already been human or the levels of human interaction with the environment have already exceeded these boundaries in certain areas. Okay, and so for example, when we're looking at land system change, one of the areas that we have already exceeded some of the boundaries is through deforestation. All right, we have deforested the planet to a level that is suboptimal and a zone of uncertainty for long-term prosperity and survival. When we get into biosphere integrity, all right, we have already exceeded, and indeed we are beyond the zone of uncertainty and into an area of high risk for rates of extinction. All right, our rate of extinction is many orders higher than what you would like to see as a normal background extinction rate. So we have pushed the boundaries of our biosphere already into a zone of depletion. And then similarly in the biogeochemical flows, we have disrupted natural nutrient cycles largely through the process of fertilization as it relates to nitrogen and phosphorus in the environments. And so that has significant disruptive effects, right? And then the big one that we're all thinking about is climate change, okay, and the way in which the human addition of greenhouse gases to the environment is changing this. So this is a visual representation then of ecological sustainability as defined by the group at the Stockholm Resilience Center. And they say, here are our limits that we should be working at. And then how, right? The question would become, how do we use law and policy to get these limits, to get these zones back into the safe areas below the boundaries of concern? Okay, so that's one example at the international level. Now let's think about a second example. Let's bring it a little bit closer to home. And for this, right, I promised there would be whales and, or in this case, large dolphins, and here they are. So we're talking about the southern resident killer whales. And specifically, let's think about the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, which is currently under construction and will increase significantly the diluted bitumen that is transported from in and around Edmonton to Burnaby, British Columbia. Now, in the review process for deciding to approve this project, the plight of the southern resident killer whales was considered by the National Energy Board and Governor and Council, and it was concluded ultimately that this project expansion will have a significant adverse effect on their ability to survive in the Salish Sea and in the waters off of Canada and the United States. So the decision is made on economic and social grounds to proceed with this project. The project recognizes that a casualty might end up being the fate of the southern residents who are already critically endangered because of a number of ongoing disruptions to their environment in this heavily populated and heavily utilized inland sea. Now, I would pitch to you that if we are looking at this from a perspective of sustainability, ecological sustainability, and rather than sustainable development, we would approach the approval process from a different angle. Instead of saying, do we need to develop and increase the capacity of this pipeline for economic and social benefit, we would say, what are the environmental outcomes that are likely, and what is it that our environment in the areas that are going to be impacted can still handle? And so we would look at the southern resident killer whale population, for example, as one of many considerations that would be done along the route of the pipeline, and say, what is the state or the status of their environment, and what are the ecological conditions that they need to survive, right? What are the conditions or the concentrations of prey that they need? So here's a picture of their staple prey item, which is the Chinook salmon. And also we would say, what is the quality, the acoustic quality of the marine environment that is needed, right? As we think about additional tanker traffic coming through here. And based on those criteria, we would use law and policy not to approve additional projects. Rather, we would use law and policy to secure the conditions that are needed for the long-term survival of this species. All right, which is highly regarded as one of the most iconic species in Canadian land or water. All right, so that would be a very different way of looking at it. And instead of saying the Trans Mountain Pipeline is in the public interest because it serves social and economic outcomes, we would say it is not, right, in the interest of ecological sustainability, because it is going to have these significant consequences or exacerbate the plight of a critically endangered species. All right, so that's the paradigm shift that we would be working at. So moving from those emotive examples, I think, to something a little bit more local, let's jump in and think about what ecological sustainability might mean for local conservation actions, for local management decisions, or for our relationship with the North Saskatchewan River. So I think the first place to start when we're having a discussion about the river is, and as a lifelong Edmontonian, or I'm now in St. Albert, so someone in and around Edmonton, I must say that there has been a significant change in the narrative around the North Saskatchewan River in my lifetime. And I was someone that spent a lot of time hiking and occasionally on the water on the North Saskatchewan in my youth and through up until now. But I've seen a very significant change in perception and approach to the river. It went from something when I was young that I was warned not to touch, right now to water that is recognized as being cleaner and probably more usable than many of the lakes that I would have frequented and swum in my youth, right? The amount of recreation on the river that we see in Edmonton has gone up, not in a linear fashion, I would say near exponential over the last couple of years, with people being on or around the river and the river valley. And I think that while we've always recognized that the river and the river valley are the jewel really of Edmonton, in many respects, it has taken on a resource of common concern status. So it has really, I think, captured the imagination of residents, but also city council, land developers, and conservation groups in a different way. And so it is a resource of common concern. And I think that status that it holds in our city means that maybe it could help inspire a new approach to its management, or at least we should be advocating for new approaches for its management, such that it can not only be what it is currently, but enhance those benefits as we go forward. And so the importance of local conservation can't be understated. As I explore in the report on municipal biodiversity, there are many benefits to a biodiverse and healthy river and associated river valley. It creates a more livable environment. It improves the quality of life for humans, both physical and mental, but it also improves the quality of life for wildlife. It helps connect people to the non-human built world, which has aesthetic and ethical dimensions to it. It provides important environmental services to us, including air quality services, water quality services, soil stability, pollination services, flood buffering, and climate resilience as we move forward in the period of anthropogenic climate change. And then the one that I thought we could focus on for the remainder of this discussion, although I'd love to hear your thoughts in the Q&A around different benefits or different concerns around the management of the North Saskatchewan River, is what it means to maintain connectivity and to maintain the integrity of our river ecosystem and the river valley as a wildlife corridor. So as an area that is resilient to change, as an area that connects not only Edmontonians to the river, but also helps connect wildlife as they move through the city or as they move from one landscape to the next. All right, and so that's the kind of the theme that I would like to look at for what ecological sustainability might mean if we're thinking about improving the functionality of the river and the river system and its valley as a wildlife corridor. So let's think about that in a little bit more detail then, for what the law and policy options are for trying to strengthen the role of the river and the river valley as a wildlife corridor. So a wildlife corridor, in simple terms, is a protected corridor of land and water that serves as suitable wildlife habitat, and that functions to allow animals to move within it and between areas suitable for their habitation. So when we're thinking about the North Saskatchewan, it's not only the river itself, but it's also the river's tributaries, and it's obviously the river valley more proper. So the buffer zone that extends beyond the water into the forested or vegetated areas beside it. And these are areas that in the city even are rich in biodiversity. All right, our river valley and the river are an important place for migratory songbirds and waterfowl. They are an important route of access and movement for resident and migratory mammals. They are an important source of riparian or water-based vegetation, habitat for reptiles, amphibians, and various fish species. Okay, now, obviously, when we're thinking about the river, we experience it most frequently where we live. And so we experience it in an urbanized way. And we experience it in a way where human-built infrastructure naturally poses a threat right, to the functionality of the river and the river valley as a wildlife corridor, because urbanization and human-built infrastructure disrupts ecosystem connectivity and reduces the effectiveness of the corridor to buffer against environmental changes that might occur as we go forward. Okay, and so how can we coexist essentially in an ecologically sustainable way with the river as we live also in an area of high population density and of increasing urbanization. Now, the city of Edmonton's obviously recognized this, the importance of the river valley. Obviously, lots of people know that this is the longest and one of the most robust, if not the most robust area of municipal parks in all of North America. We are very fortunate for the status of the river valley that we currently have. And the city acknowledges this in their biodiversity report from a bit more than a decade ago, where they say the river valley is the most critical component for wildlife movement and ecological processes in Edmonton and in the surrounding area, and is identifiable as a regional biological corridor. And so we want to sustain that, right? When we're thinking about human development, when we're thinking about urbanization, ecological sustainability would say, if we have identified this as a goal, and if we can identify thresholds, then we want to make sure that we have limits and that we do our best to maintain and improve the ability of our river and river valley to function in this manner. Okay, so how would we do that? So how do we transition then this theory of ecological sustainability to something like the benefit of a wildlife corridor within our city, and then transition that into establishing management priorities or legal actions that are actually going to help to achieve it? Well, a first step, I would suggest, is that we have to quantify the ecological limits that will help maintain or enhance the functionality of this wildlife corridor, right? So just as we were interested in what the planetary limits are for some of these large-scale environmental changes, and as I suggested, we should be interested in the habitat conditions or ecosystem conditions that are necessary for the southern resident killer whales to persist in the Salish Sea. When we're thinking about our river valley and we're thinking about an ecologically sustainable river and river valley, we also should be looking to quantify some ecological limits based on the best available science. And so what that means is, in the context of a wildlife corridor, what level of habitat fragmentation or physical disruption is permissible, right? What do we currently have? And what do we want to achieve, or what would be optimal for maximizing the ability of wildlife to live within and move between different landscapes using our river valley? Second, we want to get a baseline. We want to survey, record, and monitor biodiversity within the river valley and within the river itself. And we'd want to be able to understand changes to that biodiversity if and when they occur. And third, we'd look to measure what we are able to record against thresholds for optimal environmental conditions, right? We would want to say, what do we need to achieve if we're going to operationalize this duty? What is it that we want to set out to ultimately achieve to get what is desirable from an ecological perspective? And then, right, the fun work begins. So once you've identified what those limits or thresholds are, well, then let's think about utilizing law and policy tools to achieve ecological sustainability. And I've put down here a couple thoughts that I think fit within this framework that we could draw on the city's bylaw or land use powers to try and achieve. So one, is how we can legally protect more of the remaining green space and urban parkland that currently features within the Edmonton River Valley. But I believe currently it's less than 50% that is protected, and how could we increase that to really give more weight to a protected corridor that extends fully throughout the city. Second, how can we use our powers, our law, and our policy to naturalize and restore degraded habitat? Right, and a great example that we've seen discussed in Edmonton over the last couple of years is the daylighting of Mill Creek. All right, one of the last functional tributaries not a functional tributary anymore. I was thinking about White Mud Creek, which is the functional tributary. So Mill Creek, one that was filled in years gone by, and now efforts that have come forward to try and daylight it, meaning to increase the ecosystem functionality of areas that were previously built over or filled in. All right, so that's the sort of project that could be undertaken to improve the ecological sustainability of the river and its associated ecosystems. Third, how do we limit the encroachment of built infrastructure, right? So when we're thinking or when the city is considering new projects, we should have at the forefront the need of cementing over or of building up in a human context some of the infrastructure that's there. So instead of looking at concrete paths, how are there different ways or different possibilities for maintaining more naturalized pathways? Okay, and to the same extent, how do we encourage low impact recreational uses, right? What do we make of manicured green spaces such as golf courses? How can we work with those areas to try and improve their functionality as part of the ecosystem? Another one, how do we limit or ban pesticide and herbicide applications within the river valley and associated ecosystems to minimize the impact on flora and fauna? How do we encourage citizen education? How do we encourage citizen engagement? And how do we encourage responsible use? All right, and I think one of the main roles that a municipality can play in driving forward ecological sustainability is getting citizens involved, right? Creating or encouraging citizen scientists to participate in biodiversity monitoring and study, to try and encourage citizens to utilize and steward their local environment in a way that is low impact and that garners a feeling of community and personal interest in the environment that's just out your back door. And then finally, obviously, we're talking about a river. This is a river that, right, starts in the Columbia ice field and then drains into the Hudson's Bay after going through multiple provinces and combining with the South Saskatchewan. So as a municipality, you're limited because you experience the river as it moves through your city, right? And so one of the approaches here, I think that is obviously necessary, is enhancing intermunicipal cooperation and regional cooperation, be it with the province or at a different level to achieve similar outcomes or similar goals, because the ecological sustainability of water that is transient through your city is something that you can't achieve in and of yourself. It is something that requires a higher level of cooperative action, and that's an additional layer that should be explored. And I guess, it's great to start thinking about these things, but another question is, can we achieve it? All right, now I promised Pat that yes, I would reference the Constitution by the end of my talk. So here we are in my second last slide, and I'm proud to say that the Constitution comes up. So municipalities are not constitutionally recognized levels of government, and rather they derive their authority from provincial legislation, something that we've heard a little about in the news in the days and weeks behind us. Now, the piece of legislation that's pertinent to Alberta is the Municipal Government Act. And here, environmental protection hasn't traditionally been a focus of this enabling legislation. And the dominant paradigm has been nature managed for human development and utilitarian objectives rather than managing the environment for its own benefit. But the 2015 amendment process really, I think, kicked off a new possibility for municipalities in that it included a new purpose that can be used to justify bylaw powers or the enactment of bylaws. And that is that it included the following language: that municipalities have as a purpose to foster the well-being of the environment. And what does that mean? All right, it doesn't say foster the well-being of the environment simply for the benefit of the citizens of the city. It is a freestanding obligation that also allows for action that fosters the well-being of the environment for itself as a legitimate purpose in and of itself. And that, I think, is an area that resonates, right, with environmental sustainability, ecological sustainability, because there we are saying municipalities can act and indeed should act to foster the well-being of the environment, even if, right, the outcomes that we are looking to achieve are for a better wildlife corridor, a more resilient city for climate change, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's something where I think there's a lot of potential to put some of these ideas and perspectives to work in a meaningful way. All right, and future developments, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention how what I'm talking about in this particular paradigm shift or shift of perspective fits with the other shifts that have been seen or discussed in previous webinars, because conceptualizing of ecological sustainability goes hand in hand with other developments that are being discussed and put forward, including ecological justice, striving for the right to a healthy environment at a local, regional, or national level, and then also looking to create the rights of nature and giving rivers legal personhood, right? So there's a lot of interesting developments that expand beyond just recognizing a principle as something different than a balancing between social, economic, and environmental outcomes that could really help drive forward the way in which the law perceives of, appreciates, and hopefully protects our environment and our natural world for many generations to come. So I'll leave it there in terms of the formal part of the discussion, and I'll maybe pull my screen up. I can stop the share if you want to have a bit more of a discussion, but I'll leave this formal part behind, and I'll happily take any questions that you might have. So I'm not sure the best way to do this. Should I be pulling up the chat, Pat, or?
Sorry, Kim, I lost you there. I don't know if it was my internet or yours, but anyway, just
How much of it did you lose me for? The whole thing?
Just the very end. Just the very end.
Well, I enjoyed my talk, so
Well,
I'm not sure if anyone else heard it.
I don't think you're alone, or you're not alone in having enjoyed your talk. There are a lot of questions here for you, so I'm just going to get right to them. And P.S. Thank you for mentioning the Constitution.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right,
sorry, it was on the second last slide.
That's okay. It brings it all together. The Constitution. The Constitution also runs through it. Anyway, this is a whole other discussion. Now, I'm going to start with one question which came in early, and it was just basically asking you to comment. I'm just going to look forward here again on the fact that when they talk about, this person says, I invite your comment on sustainable development in the sense that it doesn't account for the collective impact in terms of, for example, a company that may need to be operating sustainably in a specific area, and in that same area, another company is operating sustainability, but on the basis of its oil field development,
Yeah.
and then another might be developing sustainably through hunting and trapping and fishing. So all those cumulative impacts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic question, Ken. And it's something that the law really continues to grapple over. So now we'll think about it more at a regional level, and cumulative effects analysis, cumulative effects assessment is not done well. It's not something that's been traditionally done well here, and it's not something that's traditionally been done well in a lot of other jurisdictions. So we do have, right, the land use framework legislation in Alberta that led to some regional plans that tried to capture, I guess, sustainable outcomes at a regional level, considering something like cumulative effects analysis. Similarly, under the new Canadian environmental assessment legislation, there is the possibility of doing cumulative effects assessment. So we're making some inroads in that regard, but I think you hit the nail on the head when you say that sustainability has to start from that perspective of understanding what the conditions in the environment are, and then trying to work almost reverse engineer from that what we think can fit within those limits. And I think that example I tried to give for the southern resident killer whales, well, not Alberta, kind of achieves that, because it says what are the ecological conditions in an area that we want to sustain, and then working back from that, what level of development or encroachment or industrial activity are we able to fit within that, right? So that is a shift, and and by we I mean decision makers, and the legislation usually looks at things project by project, and if you do that, it's death by a thousand cuts, right? And so that becomes a very difficult approach. So it's a great question, and I think that's going to be one of the core challenges that we have for these questions of ecological sustainability is how do you deal with the cumulative effects of development in an area, and then how do we figure out what we want to put in, or in a lot of circumstances, how do we learn to say no?
Okay, right. Thank you. So this is more a comment than a question from Rod Olstad, saying aggregate strip mining often takes place along or near rivers and creeks. And the closer the mining is done to water bodies, including when it's done below the water table, the less sustainable such mining becomes. And in those cases, aggregate mining impacts groundwater quality and quality and aquifer integrity. It would be great if there were legal and other effective tools to protect related ecological sustainability, as existing legislative legal tools do not seem to be very effective. So his understanding is that Section 60 of the MGA, the Municipal Government Act, gives municipalities direction, control, and management of water within their boundaries. But despite that, municipalities and counties are typically resistant to exercising that authority, especially as relating to aggregate strip mining in Alberta. And he says, as usual, financial economic benefits typically trump ecological values. Can you comment then on why this occurs? Why municipalities appear to be resistant to exercising their authority?
Rod, that's a great question. So, and you're getting into something I'd have to do a bit of research on before I was able to give, I think, a good answer here. Now, obviously, when we're talking about authority over water, we're getting into shared authority, right? Because we have the Provincial Water Act. Water is a property right vested in the Crown of Alberta. You end up with authority that might be needed, or authorization that might be needed federally, when we're talking about activities that could disrupt habitat for fish, or could be lethal to fish. So now all of a sudden we're engaging federalism questions, and then we're looking at what a municipality could do within its own boundaries for water management. So there's definitely a lot going on here. And my sense would be there's quite a bit of deference that's given from the city to the province, probably for some of these issues. But without doing research, I'm not sure I could give you the great answer on the impact of aggregate mining and the exercise of municipal authority over water resources. And I apologize for that, but I think I don't want to get in over my head on that one. So I would have to defer to maybe following up. But happily, you could shoot me an email, and I'm happy to chat with you further about this offline, because you pose a really interesting question.
Okay, and the next question I was going to ask you refers also to Section 60 of the Municipal Government
Thanks,
Act.
Pat.
Maybe I'll just pass on that one. I
Yeah.
apologize to the person who's asking the question, but it's specific to that section of the Municipal Government Act. Now, this comment is, there is a major interest and regulation from provincial and federal requirements in protecting wildlife in the, and I don't know what these acronyms stand for, NSR, and to be specific, DFO.
Yeah.
Do you know what those acronyms are? In protecting fish habitat and provincially identified key wildlife and biodiversity zones.
Yeah, so for sure. So we have provincial and federal legislation that is protecting species if they are falling within protected areas, or if they are a species of concern, or one that is listed for different purposes. So that is without a doubt that there's some overlap here. Now, I do think, though, when we're thinking about a municipal level, there could be some really interesting work that's done at municipal levels to align and to complement some of the conservation work that's being taken at provincial and federal levels. I know that there's ongoing discussions to create an urban national park in Ontario, and I think that those are the sorts of developments that we could be looking at also, is saying how do we align the interests of protected species or protected plants or animals with what's being done provincially or federally. So I think that the cooperative aspect is something that could be picked up on. Now, unfortunately, while there is interest in protecting endangered species, the short answer is also that the federal and provincial governments do a poor job of it. So that species are more likely to get listed as more significantly threatened than to be delisted as they move through that process. So some challenges there for sure. No shortage of interest, but often the on the ground implementation is quite difficult to achieve.
Okay, thank you. Um, now, do you know of any examples, and a number of people have asked this question, of jurisdictions that have implemented holistic law-based systems that center on ecological sustainability and explicitly place it above social or economic considerations? Do you know of any as
Well,
examples?
so the law, I mean, as an overarching framework, the law is not often utilized to put ecological sustainability at the forefront. Now, that's not to say that there aren't attempts that are made in certain circumstances to get or to expand it to a certain level. So, for example, you could have, right, in a certain circumstance, all of a sudden, a species has become so critically endangered that without emergency intervention, you could end up with that species being obliterated. And the Species at Risk Act at the federal level does give the federal government emergency power to intervene and to assert, right, a level of authority that could interfere with provincial rights, that can protect that species on an emergency basis. So to a certain level then, right, ecological sustainability is coming in at the back end of that legislation as a way of saying we need to intervene to prevent something catastrophic from happening. But the dominant paradigm for environmental law has been permissive regulation, which is meaning that you're allowed to pollute, but we're going to allow you to pollute to a certain level. You're allowed to impact species, we're going to allow you to impact them to a certain level. And it's only when you exceed those levels that then the punishment is incurred. But what ecological sustainability would try and do is flip that. So then it would put those at the forefront, and it wouldn't be something that comes in at the end, right? It wouldn't be something that comes in at the end. So, there aren't great examples of law that has led with ecological sustainability. We are seeing more modern iterations of law and policy that do a better job, right, of engaging this question. So, for example, the most recent federal environmental assessment legislation does have as one of the factors when considering whether or not to approve a project, whether or not this project makes a contribution to sustainability, right? And in that aspect, we'd be thinking about ecological conditions and perspectives. Now, it's just one of the considerations. So it's not the overarching perspective, right? And you could imagine laws being reframed as requiring that from the outset, right? So what is the contribution to ecological sustainability that we can make? Or how does this fit within those limits, within those boundaries? Okay, and so that's where we could be going. And I'd like to be able to point to some of the international climate action to say, that's where we're going, and that's part of the goal with those targets, right? Every time they're setting these large targets, trying to work us towards a limit, they're trying to stop the dangerous level of anthropogenic climate change from occurring based on human emissions. Now, we're not achieving that, but and those targets are arguably set not suboptimal. They're not strict enough, but that is part of the goal. So it's working its way in. Although I couldn't point to a law that in and of itself drives that forward effectively.
Okay. All right. Well, work to be done. Now, thinking about the duty to protect and restore, there is a lot of species focused environmental regulation. For example, the Wildlife Act focusing on species at risk versus habitat restoration types of regulation. For example, the Alberta Wetland Policy. Do policies focusing on protecting broader ecosystems like wetlands, native prairies, alpine, etc., better support the goal of ecological sustainability, or is there room for both types of regulation?
Yeah. I mean, I think for sure there's room for both. I think there's room for both, but I would say that they're both needed, right? Because you can't have the species without the habitat, so they go hand in hand. So the same way that the Federal Endangered Species Act, one of its main action-oriented objectives is to identify and legally protect critical habitat, right? So you can't have one without the other. So they're incredibly important. But at the same time, ecological sustainability is going to be more than just the presence or absence of a particular animal on the landscape. It's also going to be, right, what is the contribution of wetlands, right, as they're functioning in the ecosystem as natural filters, as buffers for flooding, etc. That's something that wouldn't be protected through endangered species legislation unless one of the species that we were looking for was there, and that was the critical habitat. But it still has a very important role to play in in the larger question of ecological sustainability. And so I would say we need both, right? It has to be law that is concerned with the inhabitants of the landscape, but it is law that is also looking to protect the landscape for what it is and how it functions in and of itself.
Okay. Now, do you know of, just a second here. Do you feel it is more productive to pursue a shift away from sustainable development toward ecological sustainability, or to advance the acceptance and use of ecological economics when developing the calculations that inform decisions?
So ecological economics, you'd be getting into like the cost benefit analyses of the contributions of different ecosystems. I mean, I think, or trying to quantify the benefits that we are deriving from it. I think, both are going to be by necessity human interpretations of the natural world. My perception of what should be protected and how should be protected will differ from yours, and we might have different ways of articulating that. And I think that maybe we could use ecological economics as one of the tools that helps us achieve ecological sustainability. I'm not sure that we would have to substitute them if one can be a vehicle through which we understand the importance and the contribution of the environment, not only to us but also to the provision of ecological goods and services. Then I think that maybe the best course of action is to consider in a multidisciplinary way how it can be defined, characterized, utilized in various contexts.
Okay, thank you. I just want to point out the fact that there is information in the Q&A that I hope people are checking. For example, there's apparently a move for a pesticide ban this spring, and there's a link to that. And also someone's pointed out that I think it's that the Edmonton River Valley has become an urban park. So some factual information there that is useful. Here's another good question, many good questions here. Just a second, where was it? Or maybe this is more of a comment. Residential land development has a higher impact on the environment than any project like a pipeline through sensitive environmental areas. These are the benefit of residential development cannot be even compared. It is a benefit to individuals and smaller groups. Yet to accommodate specific lifestyle, we are losing a battle and not even accommodating a significant population, meaning a greater population. So the idea of residential land development being more harmful, if I understand this question, than something like the development of a pipeline. Any comments on that?
So, Pat, maybe you could reframe that question. So what am I looking? I'm looking to compare the impact of urbanization against something like a project-specific environmental harm.
That's how I understand this question. I hope I'm right in that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, for sure, and this is, this has been a live issue in Alberta and elsewhere in the world for a long time. The process or the path of urbanization that we're continuing down, and this we can trace this back for quite some time in Edmonton. I mean, I'd encourage people to take a look at the some of the lost waterways and wetlands of Edmonton. I mean, there were lakes that were drained there, right? We drive over Groat Creek, which was a functional creek that was cemented and cased in the 1960s for roadways. So this is something that definitely resonates and rings true. And for most people, our environmental impacts are going to be most significant where we reside, right? And as communities and as a city, we should be looking at the best ways we can develop. I mean, over the last, and this is actually something that inspired some of the work for me that led to my biodiversity report in 2019, was the commute that I did between St. Albert and Edmonton, coming to work, and the way in which some beautiful farmland, stands of trees, and really a wildlife corridor where I would see moose and deer and coyotes and fox along the Henday was transformed over the years by fields that were stripped of their topsoil, by warehouses that were erected and have stood vacant, and by a natural corridor that was really transformed into something that was built and unused or suboptimally used, in my perspective. And so those questions of urban sprawl, those questions of residential development, trace back a long period of time and have a very detrimental impact on our local environment. And that raises lots of questions about the ways in which the city should be developing urban density and infill. So lots of really interesting, I think, outcomes that we could be looking at there, for more sustainable ways of utilizing our environment going forward. And biodiversity conservation, it starts in your backyard, right? And it starts with the decisions that you're using, and it starts with the way that you connect your land or your property to the stand of trees that is down the street, to the body of water that is a kilometer or two away, and to the river valley that might be even a little bit further than that. So it's a great point, and definitely one of the issues that city managers and urban planners and elected individuals have to have on their agenda.
Okay, thank you. So many interesting comments here. I'll just point out by Linda Duncan. There are table changes to SEPA. The table changes to SEPA regretfully adopt this outdated idea of sustainability and environmental rights requiring a balance with economic interest. Are you engaged in the city River Valley modernization of the River Valley?
So only tangentially, and something that I mean, these are issues that resonate with me, and things that, things that really I think about quite a bit when I hear of projects that are being proposed or development that's being done in the River Valley, in and around the River Valley, because often I think, if it can be sold to the population that the best development is one that is preservation of the natural spaces in a way that can be equitably accessible, right, for populations, and long-term stewarded. I mean, to me, that's the ultimate of a project. That is the ultimate way in which our city can be showcased and preserved. It's not through new infrastructure that allows, unique ways or vistas of visiting or engaging with the river valley. But I think that's not only resisting, some incentives to further build or construct in the area, but it also is an education outreach piece that shows individuals and communities how you can use your river valley in a natural way to really get the maximum benefit out of it. So, to me, modernization of the river valley would be looking at it as a drive to preserve the ecological sustainability and maximize the connectivity, and move away from some of the shortfalls. And to echo the table changes to SEPA, we see some of that antiquated language, unfortunately, in the most recent Environmental Assessment Act too, right, where there could have been room for some really unique approaches to sustainability, but it gets watered down, and it ends up with that economic interest remaining first and foremost.
Yeah, it's these it's perceived as a balancing.
Yeah.
Now, there's a question here, which is it's water related. Water ownership is often held by companies like Nestle. What can be done to change that?
So what? Well, yeah. So questions around who has the rights to utilize, divert water. I mean, those are going to fall under the Water Act. Who applies for authorization, the uses that the water can be put to. I mean, the great way to start is becoming aware of the ways in which these are being utilized, the ways in which our freshwater uses are being put to work. If you think back to the planetary boundary slide I showed, I mean, freshwater use is one of those boundaries. It's a resource that we should guard zealously and very carefully, and demand significant action on. So a great way is to speak as a consumer, to lead with your choices, to put pressure on elected individuals to make sure that water is being utilized for effective purposes, not for unnecessary consumptive or extractive endeavors. And that starts with Nestle and extends to the oil sands, right? Hydraulic fracturing. I mean, all of those processes that contaminate or unnecessarily utilize fresh water for these consumptive practices are things that we should be shifting away from. There's so many great questions.
I do believe that Pat, she's frozen up just a second, so I'd give her a few seconds here. She'll probably pop back on.
Maybe we're almost out of time. I can, there was one great question that asked, how do we move from theory to practice for something like ecological sustainability? And therein lies the rub, right? To me, it really is trying to break that dominant paradigm, which is this is how our laws are operating for the outcomes that are perpetuating the problems that we're perceiving. And one of the efforts, and I'm not sure if I was successful in trying to present the topic the way I did, was to say we have planetary problems, we have regional problems, and we have local problems. And each problem also presents with it opportunities. And one of now it might be trite to say that, but I think one of the benefits of local conservation and local action is that it is more receptive to individuals, it is more receptive to constituents, and sometimes it can be more receptive to innovation. And so start, right, with something like a shared concern, which is the river valley. Think about ways in which we might, right, there are efforts that could be taken to restrict pesticide use in the city, ways that we could think about new naturalization projects, ways we could think about getting the North Saskatchewan River designated as a legal person, right? Ways in which we could integrate Indigenous perspectives on environmental stewardship into management plans and decisions that are being made, right? Speak up when you hear about new projects that are looking to add built infrastructure to the river valley and demonstrate, right, that there are different ways that we can do this. You might not be successful, But I think that local action is obviously, especially if we're in Alberta, I can tell you that this is not ecological sustainability is not a priority of the UCP. All right. It is not something that we are going to see under a government like this move this forward. There is no environmental department under the UCP. All right. So you need to look where you can make changes and affect change. And I think that advancing this at a local level makes a lot of sense for these things to take root and to grow. And that has to be, I think, the objective. And that's why I've always been attracted to local change.
It's a good place to start in your own
I can't help but
backyard.
get political. I'm sorry.
Well, but your point is that we all need to take this on, and
Yeah.
starting in your own backyard is a good place to start. There's so many questions I would love to get to here, and there's a lot of information in the Q&A for people, clarifications around the urban park, etc., that I hope people are reading. I'll just ask you one last question here, and because we're going a bit from the local to the international, and the question is, do you think the federal United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act that came into force in June 2021 could help shift the focus and understanding of the term sustainable development?
Yeah, I mean that's a difficult question because we're looking at where sustainable development falls within some of our earlier discussions around reconciliation and around duty to consult and around some of these decisions. And this is something that Pat and I were talking about a little bit in preparation for this, because I'm reminded of the Silcotin decision where Aboriginal or Indigenous title to land was recognized. And one of the things that the court recognized was that the land couldn't be put to uses that would destroy the connection, right, to the land, and there was a stewardship obligation that seemed to be invited into that analysis. And one of the problems I have with that is that we have the courts recognizing additional obligations for First Nations communities with title over land than what the government holds, or with what other individuals hold in society, and the ways in which we're expected to use land. So I would say that society at large needs to start thinking about the ways in which we steward our land, the ways in which we perceive of the needs of future generations from that ecological perspective, recognizing that without that as the foundation, we undermine our social and our economic prospects. And if that means looking at some of the language and looking at the process of reconciliation and legislative developments that are ongoing with First Nations communities in Canada, I think that can be beneficial, although I would not want to download that responsibility onto those communities. Rather, I think it falls to others to take that lead and to demonstrate what it can mean, as opposed to limiting in another context First Nations rights. Yeah.
There's so much here, honestly. I'm going to have to bring us to a close. We're at the end of our hour and a half long time here. I wish we could go on, because there are a number of other questions to be asked and answered, and I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to get to them all. But Cam, I just want to thank you so much for your presentation. And I want to point out the fact that this entire series, Reimagining Rivers series, and the culmination of the series, which will be a symposium that we're hosting in June, where we hope to take people right down to the river and talk about various jurisdictional impediments to a thriving environment like a river, for example, is all the result of a conversation that you and I had probably 2.5 years ago in a little coffee shop. And some of it had to do with municipalities, and how municipalities have so much environmental responsibility dumped on them, if I can put it that way, even though they don't figure at all in the Constitution per se. They're at the, provincial governments control municipalities, as we've seen in Ontario. So anyway, I just want to thank you for bringing all of this to our attention, and for your great presentation today. I mean, it's the tip of the iceberg. There's so much to do and so much change, but your commitment is just phenomenal. And so thank you. It was a very, very rich presentation.
Well, I don't want to pump the tires on the report, but I would say that my tour that was planned, COVID really canceled my tour that was planned for this report. The tour of Alberta's municipalities to talk about this. So it is available online through the Alberta Land Institute. And I know from these questions that there's a lot of interest in some of the details. And I think that those that are interested might find some stuff to chew on in there, and hopefully some optimism and some hope for ways in which we can get involved to usher in a different approach to stewardship at a local level and beyond.
Thank you. And I want to let people know that we will be posting Cam's PowerPoint presentation on our website so that you can find the link to that report on the PowerPoint presentation itself. And someone pointed out a little glitch in one of the slides. We'll fix that. And anyway, but it'll be up on our website probably tomorrow. So thank you again, Cam. And I'd also like to thank our administrator, Zara Ahmed, and our public legal education coordinator, Alina Rietsma, for their work in preparing, advertising, and running the webinar. I'd like to thank our audience for their involvement and their engagement. We had about 200 people at one point listening to you, Cam, and many people commented and provided some really useful information in the Q&A. So
I've never had so many people in my house.
This is the wonders of technology.
Yeah.
And so I want to remind people that this webinar is being recorded. It will be available on our website and likely on the Environmental Law Center's website as well, probably tomorrow. And also to remind you that you'll be receiving a link to a short feedback form, allowing you to give us some feedback on this presentation and make suggestions for others. Please do fill those feedback forms in. We really, really do appreciate it a great deal. So that brings us to a close. And so thank you so much, Cam, for your presentation. And we'll be advertising the symposium, which we hope to host in person in June, sometime in the next few months. So thank you all very much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.